There has been a 3D challenge going on called the Moving Meditations Challenge that is open to all artists worldwide who are tasked with taking a simple template and crafting an epic scene. So here's my submission to the challenge, and in this video I'm going to go over how I made this possible. As soon as I heard the word Tai Chi, I was like, yes, a waterbender. Naturally, I'm an Avatar fan, so I'm obviously going to do that. I wanted it to be surrounded by water so they were close to their element, and then I could frame it with mountains and rocks and greenery, but it wasn't a very clear idea at the time, so I was like, the next step to do, now that I have an idea, is to get some references. Using Pinterest, I just created a board with images that kind of fell into the theme I was going for, and pretty early on I recognized that there was a blue and green color scheme that kept coming up, and it reminded me of the swamp from the show, and I really figured that that could be a nice environment to place my character. But I really wanted my character to stand out from the background, so I thought rather than just have her be another character from the Water Tribe, it would be a lot more fun for her to be a more modern interpretation of someone from that world. So with all of that in mind, I quickly created a mock-up by photo bashing the reference images together and sketched my character as I thought she would look. I then moved on to making a reference sheet by redrawing my character in the T-bows from the front and the side. Now, I had originally intended to model the girl from scratch, but due to my own personal obligations, I wasn't able to start till mid-August. You get about a month to kind of do this challenge, and I started really late. So I took out a release from Tyler Gibson Art's book and found a character on Mixamo who was close enough to what I wanted, and I remodeled it based on my design. So as with my other projects, I really wanted my entry to still have a blend of 2D and 3D. So to get a more cartoon look, I took my model over to Clip Studio Paint's Modeler to take advantage of CSP's amazing brush engine and still be able to preview my model. Now fully textured, I wanted my character to have a reactive shadow. So to create this, I simply had to bring her back into Blender along with her textures and mix it with a Toon BSDF. By running the BSDF through a color ramp and I set it to constant, I was able to get a cel shaded look. So now with the character done, I'm able to move on to the next step, which is the animation. So the first thing I needed to do was retarget my animation onto my character rig. This was easy enough with the Rococo add-on. Unfortunately, I hadn't actually completely rigged all parts of my character, so her shirt and beads were just kind of floating in the air. So in the case of the shirt, I had to create a new rig that could be used to manually animate it. And as for the beads, it was actually a lot easier as I only had to pair it to one corresponding bone. As a final touch, I updated the animation so it would only refresh every second frame to match the 12 frames a second you typically see in cartoons. All that was required to do this was to go into the nonlinear animation tab and adding a modifier that stepped the animation every 2 frames. Simple. Moving on to the water now, I had to rely on 3 tutorials to get the look and motion I was going for. To animate the water bending, I followed the tutorial by Blendermania, but all I had to do was get an orb that was able to follow a path based on some settings that was then ran through a water simulator. What I did for my variation was to have 2 paths on either side of my character, that way she was pulling all around her where the water would coalesce into a hoop before exploding. And for the procedural shading of both the water that was bended as well as the water from the waterfall, I followed the tutorial from Christoph. And finally, to get the lake coloured in the way I wanted, along with some of the animations on the waters, I followed the tutorial by Sketches for Humanity. For the last water effect, the splash, I decided to hand animate it using Blender's grease pencil rather than model it, rig it, simulate it all over again, which was a skill that I didn't have and time I did not have to learn to do. So this is what I ended up with.
Nice.
Next I started building up my foreground using procedural texturing for the rocks and grass, as well as grease pencil for some of the smaller shrubs that were further in the foreground. As the deadline was fast approaching, I decided to download a palm tree and some grass from Sketchfab, rather than model it myself. At this point I also experimented with having the statue as an image plane as a solution to the time constraint. Moving on to the background, I decided to make the mountains and trees in a separate blend file. This was a more organised way of working. I decided to texture paint the objects in CSP rather than use a shader, as I wanted to make it hard to tell what was 2D and 3D elements. Finally, I had the whole scene sandwiched between two 2D planes that I hand painted digitally in Clip Studio Paint. With all the animating done, it was time to export my scene using the render engine EVs, separating it into 4 key layers: the background, midground, lines, and the foreground. I took the midground sequence and the lines over to Clip Studio Paint, where I coloured over the minor mistakes like clipping through the clothes and erased unnecessary lines. To make my character more expressive, I hand drew over the eyes and mouth, that way she could both blink and smile, breathing new life into the character and allow her to connect with the audience. I then exported it one more time as an image sequence. Lastly, I threw my 3 layers into Davinci Resolve, added the blur effect to the background, and sent it off. Now, unfortunately, after submitting and the deadline passing, I noticed a minor speck that I accidentally left in, so I made one more version where I took the opportunity to remove it and make the splash match the colour of the lake. So here it is, my final piece. It was rather intense as I was learning as I went, but it was a lot of fun and great to see my ideas come to life. It's hard to say how long I dedicated to these 6 seconds of animation, since a good chunk of it was me just watching a bunch of YouTube tutorials. I've put the animation up on my channel already as a separate video if you'd like to see it uncropped and soak up the ambience, and I added links to tutorials and models I use for my animation in the video description. Feel free to jot down in the comments if you have any questions on anything I mentioned in this video, or just generally if this has been helpful at all. Thank you so much for watching and your time, and until next time, see ya.